Russian President Vladimir Putin says his country will not be intimidated as he welcomed an election victory that puts him on course to be the longest-serving Russian leader in more than 200 years. Russians abroad have been voting in the election, and they've been able to express their opposition to President Vladimir Putin. Harry Fawcett has been at the Russian embassy in London, where expats, most of them dissidents, cast their ballots.
So here in West London, outside the Russian embassy, this has been the scene throughout the day. People waiting patiently in this line, having to wait patiently. This line taking more than 3 hours sometimes before people get their chance to vote. Some pro-Putin voters, but the overwhelming majority of people here, certainly those we've spoken to, intend to vote against the Russian president.
I don't support the war. I don't support the corruption and things need to be changed.
We were talking about this with my friends earlier. None of us have voted in the presidential elections before. And I think it's partly because we didn't trust it. And we still don't trust it. You know, nothing has changed in that sense. But we just decided it's time to come out.
As for your vote, do you feel it'll be counted and fairly marked down?
No, it won't be counted, but it will signal people inside the system who do see the true numbers, what the numbers are.
This hasn't been happened for many years. And thanks to Alexei Navalny, he put us all back together.
At Russian embassies around the world, protesters have organized protests at midday against Vladimir Putin. That was a scene in Berlin where we saw the widow of Alexei Navalny, Yulia Navalnaya, join the queue for voters there in Berlin. And there's been a similar scene here in London, just across the road from the embassy. A protest that's been going on throughout the day. The organizers of this protest say it's vital that people come and vote, even if they are disillusioned by Russian democracy, in order to keep politically active and to make their voices heard. Harry Fawcett, Al Jazeera, London.
We're joined now from Moscow by Dorsa Jabbari. So, Dorsa, Putin has claimed an overwhelming victory, surprising no one. As Yulia just reminded us, there isn't a ton that's expected to change on the domestic or even international scene. What's the next step, then? I assume his inauguration.
That's right, Cyril. According to the laws in the country, the president will have his inauguration ceremony in the month of May, and we expect the Russian president to pick his new cabinet in the coming weeks. We don't expect any major changes in that cabinet that is currently in place, but there might be some ministers that will be shifted around. Now, the most important statement made by Russian President Vladimir Putin late on Sunday evening was that his victory is going to strengthen the country. That is the kind of messaging that we've been seeing since early this morning, being broadcast across state TV channels here, reiterating the sense of unity that is coming with this victory. Of course, not everyone shares that opinion. According to an independent Russian activist group, at least 88 protesters, were detained across the country with a number of offenses in attempts to try and disrupt the voting process.
And Dorsa, today marks, if I can get you to pivot to this, marks the 10-year anniversary of Russia's annexation of Crimea. What are you expecting on that?
Well, this is a big day for Vladimir Putin. Every year, he holds a huge rally to commemorate the occasion, and this year will be no different. And it's going to be held at one of the most iconic locations in the capital, in the Red Square, near the Kremlin. The president is expected to deliver a speech. Huge crowds are expected to gather. The area has been preparing and cordoned off for the past 48 hours in preparation for this event. This is an opportunity for Vladimir Putin not only to speak to the Russian nation, but also to deliver his message to the international community that what he did in Crimea in 2014 was something that was wanted by the local population there. Of course, the Ukrainian government at that time called it a violation of international law. The United Nations General Assembly condemned the move, saying it was illegal and that it was a temporary occupation. The government in Moscow said that they held a referendum and over 90% of the local population voted in favor of joining Russia. And they don't use the term annexation. The Russian president had said that this was the will of the people and that is what they wanted. Of course, that is a rhetoric that we've heard now over the past 2 years as well, with Russia annexing a further 4 regions of Ukraine in September of 2022. So overall, we expect this to be a big day for the newly re-elected Russian president to really show his supporters and the country and the international community how much unified his country is and what kind of support is behind him.
Dorsa Jabbari reporting from Moscow. Thank you very much, Dorsa. And polling also took place in Ukrainian territories under Russian control. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says that those votes are illegal.
These days, the Russian dictator is imitating another election. It is clear to everyone in the world that this figure, as has happened so often in history, is simply sick from power and is doing everything he can to rule forever. There is no evil he will not commit to prolong his personal power.
And Rob McBride reports on the Ukrainian view of this election from Kyiv.
This election is widely regarded here in Ukraine as a farce, albeit one that, according to Ukraine, is accompanied by threats, intimidation and bribery in the Russian-controlled territories of Ukraine where this ballot is being held. According to Ukrainian intelligence, election officials in places like Zaporizhia and Kherson have been going door to door with ballot boxes accompanied by armed soldiers and also agents from Russia's security service, the FSB, apparently to explain to voters whom to vote for, and also apparently explaining that a vote not for Vladimir Putin might be considered to be anti-Russian. There's also talk of pressure being placed on business owners and public employees such as teachers to turn out and vote. Meanwhile, Ukraine's parliament has condemned this whole exercise and called upon the international community to do the same. And there's also been a timely reminder, as has been issued previously when Russian occupiers, as they are known here, have held these type of ballots and elections in these controlled areas of Ukraine, that any Ukrainian citizens helping them do it may well be held accountable legally for legal action at some point in the future. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera, Kyiv.
Let's bring in Tina Burrett in Tokyo. She's a Russia specialist, professor of political science at Sofia University, author of Television and Presidential Power in Putin's Russia. So you heard, obviously, what the Ukrainians think of this election. Western powers also see this entire Russian presidential election as a parody of democracy. Now that the election is over and the result is known, I wanted your view on that, on the legitimacy of this election.
Well, I don't think anybody believes the high record vote for Vladimir Putin, except perhaps Vladimir Putin himself. So I think in terms of stage management, this is exactly what most leaders in other countries expected that we would see. There's actually been a trend. Every election that Vladimir Putin has stood in, his share of the vote has gone up, turnout has gone up. So this is nothing unexpected, I think. And I don't think it really changes people's perspective on the regime in the country.
Okay, what can we actually know about the popularity of Vladimir Putin among Russians today in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to actually get an accurate picture of what many Russians think of the administration. I think there are various different sentiments within the country. Obviously, we saw a number of people protesting at the election polling stations over the course of this weekend. There was also quite a sizable protest in January when one candidate who was anti-war was kept off the ballot. We saw lots of people also turning up for Alexei Navalny's funeral last month. So there's clearly opposition to the war and to the government within the country. I think probably the silent majority are just keeping their heads down and trying to focus on their family and getting by. And then we have a sort of core of people who perhaps are in favor of the war and support the administration. But how many people actually are in each group is very difficult to actually validate.
Okay, so I wanted to probe with you then what we might expect from the next 6 years of Vladimir Putin, both domestically and internationally. Let's start with domestically. Do you see anything changing over the next 6 years?
I think 6 years is probably a bit too far out for us to make judgments about. But I think in the sort of short term, probably very little will actually change. I think, in terms of the war itself in Ukraine, Russia has made some relatively small gains recently, but probably enough to show that the war is turning slightly more towards the Russians' favor, which I think will probably calm some of the fears within the administration itself. I think probably if we were to see a big change in Russian politics, for example, sort of fall of Vladimir Putin, that would have to come from within his own inner circle, within the Kremlin itself. And I don't really see there being very many divisions within the administration at the moment. So I think probably his political position is quite secure in the short term, given that the war is going reasonably well. As your correspondent alluded to, the economy has actually been growing, and for reasons of war production, lots of people are actually seeing their salaries going up with overtime. So I think at the moment, probably the domestic situation we can expect to see the status quo. The only thing I sort of think a lot of Russians are worried about is that if Putin is taking the election as a mandate for the war, which he claims he is in his victory speech, then I think some Russians are worried about mobilization, another mobilization of young Russian men to the front line in Ukraine. And I think that would obviously be very unpopular, especially with people who do have young men in their family and among their friends. And that could be a dangerous moment for Vladimir Putin. Now, at the moment, he's saying there won't be a new mobilization. But given the huge losses that Russia is suffering in Ukraine, I think at some point mobilization may become a necessity, and that could be a danger point for the administration.
Yeah, I was going to ask you internationally what else you might expect. You've addressed Ukraine. Is there another major chapter, major topic that you think our viewers should know about for the next term of Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, I think internationally, the Russian administration is clearly watching very closely what's going on in US politics right now. And one of the other big elections this year will be in the United States. And I think a return to power of President Trump would obviously mean that quite likely a lot of the support for Ukraine would dry up. And I think Russia is waiting to see if that is in fact the case. I think also within Europe, unfortunately, there's quite a lot of reluctance to give Ukraine what they actually need to win the war. I mean, personally, I think Ukraine could win. And I think for European security as well as for Ukraine's security, Ukraine has to win. But we're seeing the German government, for example, being reluctant to give Taurus missiles to the Ukrainians, despite the fact that the British have given Storm Shadows, which have turned the tide in the Black Sea area. So I think, it really, the ball is in the hands of the Western leaders to decide how much support they want to give to Ukraine. But the upcoming election in the United States could potentially be a game changer.
Tina Burrett joining us from Tokyo, Russia specialist and professor of political science at Sophia University. Thank you so much.